Hi, my name is David Ryder, and welcome to my presentation, From Groundwork to Implementation, a systematic review of coastal adaptation planning in Nova Scotia, Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting today in Portland, Maine, on the traditional land of the Wabanaki people. I also want to quickly thank MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network, for supporting this research, as well as the many participants in this study. I'd also like to mention that this study was conducted as part of a larger research project called Resilient Sea at the University of British Columbia. Resilient Sea is a free online platform designed to facilitate knowledge exchange about coastal hazard risk reduction strategies for communities in Canada. The platform works by identifying communities that share similar hazard vulnerability profiles and can be used to identify peer communities from coast to coast. As part of this work, we collect data about the actions that communities have undertaken in order to reduce the risks associated with these hazards, usually found in official community planning documents, hazard-specific plans, or climate change action plans. Our database contains 152 coastal communities across 4 provinces and over 1,600 risk reduction actions. And the results of this research from today's presentation, including the coastal adaptation actions that I'm going to be speaking about, have been incorporated into the platform. Moving on to this particular study. As we all know, cities around the world are at risk of major impacts from climate change, especially coastal cities. This illustrates the need for coastal adaptation, the focus of this study, which specifically addresses changes in the coastal environment. Adaptation is rarely required of municipalities, but it commonly occurs at the municipal level since land use and development are most often controlled locally. Coastal adaptation actions can be characterized according to several dimensions, which may influence aspects of their implementation. They can be characterized by the type of tool or action category employed by a local government. They can be described by their action stage, which distinguishes between groundwork, strategies that lay the foundation for change, and implementation, strategies which involve direct changes to reduce risk. Finally, for certain coastal adaptation actions, the long-term strategy captures the long-term planning approach for reducing coastal flood risk associated with climate change. However, while a considerable amount of research has been conducted on municipal adaptation strategies, most studies did not report on the implementation or progress of the adaptation actions themselves. When it comes to studying implementation, most research has focused on barriers to local adaptation. Fewer studies have explored the common factors that can enable local adaptation. Local factors that have been identified as being helpful for overcoming barriers and influencing the adoption of adaptation policies include dedicated funding for adaptation, the presence of an adaptation champion who can increase the acceptance of adaptation policies, public participation in the adaptation planning process, which can build public support to push policies forward, recent disasters or experiencing the impacts from extreme climate-related events, which can bring climate change to the forefront of public attention, and political continuity, which can be connected to better leadership, commitment, and institutional capacity for implementing adaptation policies. However, the extent to which these local factors influence whether specific adaptation policies get implemented is an under-researched topic. That brings me to our case study. Nova Scotia stands out for being the first province in Canada to establish a province-wide policy framework to address climate change adaptation. It required communities seeking access to federal gas tax revenues to undergo municipal adaptation planning. Otherwise, they would forfeit this gas tax revenue, which represents a critical source of funding for municipal operations. Each municipality completed a Municipal Climate Change Action Plan, or MCAP, in 2013, which among other components included each community's priority actions for adaptation. However, since their completion in 2013, there has been no comprehensive evaluation of the MCAPs or the progress of the priority actions contained in these plans. Using the MCAPs as the basis of our investigation, we asked, what priorities for coastal adaptation were identified in the 2013 MCAPs? Which of these actions have been implemented since? And what local factors have influenced the success of implementation? On to the methods used in this study, which included content analysis, surveys, quantitative analysis, and expert interviews. To begin, we performed content analysis to determine what priorities for coastal adaptation were contained in the MCAPs. We developed an actions collection framework, shown on the right, and coding scheme so that each priority action collected from the MCAPs could be assigned an action category, action stage, and long-term adaptation strategy based on literature. Using this framework, we reviewed each of the 35 coastal community MCAPs in the province, collecting and coding a total of 589 coastal adaptation actions identified as future priorities in these plans. Then, to determine which of these priority actions have been implemented, we created individualized surveys for each of the 35 coastal municipalities. The survey had respondents indicate the degree to which each of their community's priorities have been implemented on a numbered scale from 0 to 10, which you can see by the example on the right. The survey also included questions about the presence of the local policy factors in their communities that, based on literature, are thought to influence implementation. We received a total of 20 responses representing a diverse set of communities located across the province, shown on the map here. And from those responses, we collected implementation data for 331 priority actions. We then made use of logistic regression to model the influence of local policy factors on the implementation of planned actions. We created two logistic regression models that differed by the dependent variable, one to explain the influence of local factors on action initiation, as in whether an action gets started at all, and one that explained the influence of these factors on progress, or the degree to which actions have been implemented. For both models, we included the same three groups of independent variables. First, the community type, which distinguished communities by their physical and economic characteristics. The action type, which differentiated priorities for coastal adaptation based on our actions collection framework. And then the local policy factors mentioned earlier of most interest to this study. Lastly, after generating some preliminary findings, we conducted expert interviews to test whether the experiences of practitioners involved in MCAP implementation supported our quantitative analysis. We conducted 10 total interviews and asked participants to expand on the influence that local factors may have had on the success of implementing their community's priorities for coastal adaptation. We now have a database of the 589 planned actions for coastal adaptation contained in the MCAPs. Here's a look at the distribution of these actions according to our actions framework. First, in terms of action category, the most common is emergency preparedness, which are steps taken to prepare for and respond to emergencies created by coastal hazards like flooding. Some typical emergency preparedness actions contained in the MCAPs include establishing evacuation routes, securing backup power sources, and developing emergency communication and alert systems. The rest of the categories are all commonly planned and implemented, although construction guidelines and financing and insurance are rarely included in the MCAPs. In terms of action stage, the MCAPs contain a fairly even split between groundwork and implementation, demonstrating that the province as a whole was somewhere in the middle of the planning process when the MCAPs were completed in 2013. Common groundwork priorities include technical studies such as hazard risk assessments and many of the capacity building efforts such as informational materials and the formation of committees. Typical implementation priorities include updating land use bylaws and upgrading structural protection measures such as dikes and seawalls. For the long-term strategies on the right, which only apply to about a quarter of the actions which do constitute a long-term approach for addressing flood risk, Protect is clearly the most common strategy. Protect strategies are designed to prevent hazards and their impacts through structural mechanisms. Typical Protect strategies include strengthening or maintaining dikes and installing armor stone revetments or other structural barriers along coastal roadways and developments. Those are followed by Accommodate and Avoid strategies, and then there were very few Retreat strategies included in the MCAPs. The graph on the right shows the implementation scores among the 331 priority actions that we collected from the survey responses. Out of those, 248 or 75% have been implemented to some degree, meaning they have either been started and are in progress or have been completed. Only 83 or 25% have not been started or are unknown. Looking at this snapshot, we can conclude that the MCAP mandate has been highly successful in both motivating adaptation planning and in leading to implementation over the 6-year period between when the MCAPs were completed and when we conducted this study. Moving on to the results of our regression analysis, where we modeled the influence of local factors on the success of implementation, both in terms of action initiation and action progress. The factors that I'm going to highlight and speak about here were the statistically significant variables from one or both of our regression models. With the community type, we differentiated communities by the amount of development along their coastlines and also by their revenue per capita as a measure of the economic capacity of local governments to pay for adaptation efforts. We found that communities with less developed coastlines and higher revenue per capita are both more likely to initiate priorities for coastal adaptation and are more likely to be further along in terms of their progress. As for action type, which differentiated actions by the choice of tool or strategy, we found that coastal adaptation actions related to emergency preparedness were the most likely to be completed or further along in their progress. Lastly, when looking at the local policy factors of most interest to this study, we found two that stuck out as highly influential. First, communities with high political continuity, meaning there has been very little turnover of elected officials throughout MCAP development and implementation, are over 3 times more likely to initiate their priorities for coastal adaptation. Next, communities that incorporate public participation into the planning process are 2.5 times more likely to make progress on their initiated actions. We also found that the expert interviews strongly supported these findings related to political continuity and public participation. To conclude, our study and its contributions to the resiliency platform provide an evaluation of the MCAPs and their impact on coastal adaptation in the province, help inform future planning and implementation efforts in Nova Scotia and beyond, and facilitate connections between communities for the purpose of knowledge sharing and building resilience across Canada. Next, we're hoping to publish this study later this year and find ways to share back with not only the study participants, but other stakeholders in Nova Scotia and elsewhere. I encourage you to check out our platform via the links listed on the bottom right of the slide and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.